Today is the Yortzeit of Simcha Binim Pshischa. He was he was the Rebbe of Rebbes, and what I read about him was that he started off as a Misnagid. He grew up not in a Chassidish family. His father did not want him to become Chassidish. He actually was a merchant, and he was a pharmacist, and he did well. And he was attracted somehow to the Chosem Lublin, and he became a big Rebbe uh, from his inspiration, his from what he learned from the Chosem. I think they once said over a very interesting. I think it was said over from Reb Simcha Bina Pshischa. I think he used to speak in a cryptical fashion. He used to say things that were cryptic, and I think someone spoke in the Aguda once. He said over a very interesting word. He said over that we say in the Zmiris of Shabbos, Kol Makad Shvi Korei Eloi, Kol Shem Shabbos Kados Michaloi, Schori Harvey Ma'oid Al Pi Fa'oloi, Ish Al Machaneu V'ish Al Digloi, Al Havai Hashem, Zer Yisrael Oy Havoi, Hama'achrim Lotzeis Min HaShabbos, Umemarim Lovoi. So the question that they asked from Simcha Bina Pshischa, I think it was him, is it's out of order. It's not in chronological order. Hama'achrim Lotzeis Min HaShabbos, Umemarim Lovoi. We come to Shabbos first, and then we leave. So it should say Umemarim Lovoi, and then afterwards Hama'achrim Lotzeis Min HaShabbos. So when they asked this question to Simcha Bina Pshischa, he answered, "Falt Zagait mit in Gram." So it's Oyev Hashem Zer Yisrael Havoy after rhyme with Havoy. So therefore it says Hama'achim Lotzos Min HaShabbos Umarim Lovoi. But future Rebbes explained the deeper meaning of what Reb Simcha Bina Pshischa meant. And there's a Machlokes Bavli and Yerushalmi Ilmolei Shomer Yisrael, either one Shabbos or two Shabbos, Mashiach will come. I think the Bavli says two Shabbos. I think the Yerushalmi says one Shabbos. So I might be wrong. It might be the opposite. So the question is how do you correlate these two Gemaras? It's a steer. Is it one Shabbos or is it two Shabbos? So all the Mefarshim say that what happens if you go through a Shabbos and you maximize the Shabbos, so naturally, Kam Shaloshilus time by Rav, the Rav, and you're going to encapsulate and crystallize that Shabbos and make it part of you. So that will translate into an entire different type of week. Your week will be on a much higher level. Now, if your week will be on a much higher level, imagine with what Kedusha, with what Madrega, you're going to be Makabel Shabbos next week. And then next week will be the perfect Shabbos. So really both Gemaras mean it's one Shabbos. But in order to have one perfect Shabbos, you have to start with the Shabbos before, because that will be Goyrim, that will be Gram, to the next Shabbos being the perfect Shabbos. So really, both Yerushalmi and Bavli agree that it's one perfect Shabbos. The Gemara that says it's two Shabbos is just trying to explain that the only way to come to a perfect Shabbos is by starting already the Shabbos before. So they say that's what Reb Simcha Bina Pshischa meant. It's a guy in Gram, not only the rhyme, which is how it was taken literally, but it also means the cause and effect of two Shabbos. So Hama'achim Lotus Min HaShabbos, last Shabbos, they finished it with a bang, and they delayed leaving Shabbos because they wanted to absorb whatever Kedusha they could from Shabbos, and therefore the next Shabbos it was Memaharim Lovely. So really it's an order. I remember a speaker said that, one of our guest speakers for Shalosh Shulis said that for it, and it stuck with me. Okay, Zok the Heilige Mishnah. We're discussing the sugya of Pasei B'Rosh. We know Pasei B'Rosh is a concession made by the Rabbanon to allow Yidden that are on their way up to do a Dvar Mitzvah to have water to feed their animals. So the Mishnah here is discussing where it applies. And we really learned this Mishnah. It was quoted in the Gemara. Echad Bor Harabim. It doesn't make a difference if it's a bor, meaning it's rainwater, it's drainage water. It's not fresh spring water, but it's public. Like we learned earlier, that since it's public, in the event that it dries up, people will tell each other, "Oh, you're not allowed to carry, or you're not allowed to carry anymore in between these pasibirois because there is no more water in the bor." If it's a be'er rabim, it's best case scenario that doesn't dry up. But even be'er hayachid, which we know will not dry up, so even though it's only a private be'er and there won't be a rabbim there to warn or to make each other aware, if it would dry up, that's not a problem because it won't dry up. So all of these, oisin lehen pasin. You could rely on the kula of pasi berois to service these birds. Aval lebor hayachid.
A bear yachid needs a pasin. Is it
Well, if it's in a reshus harabim.
It's a bear. That's a yachid yishus. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So let's say you dug yourself a be'er onto 401, right? So you need to drink from it. Aval lebor hayachid. But if it was a bor, meaning it wasn't self-rejuvenating, it just gets filled up with rainwater, and it belonged to a single person, you cannot rely on pasibirois. You have to make a proper mechitza. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava Omer, ein oisin pasin elo lebe'er harab. So he's much more machmer, and he limits the use of pasibirois only to a be'er of rabbim. And we're going to see what this means. It might include a bor as well. Bilvad. But surely for a yochid, pasibirois, you cannot rely on. Ulashar, and for anything that does not qualify to the kula pasibirois, oisun chagura gavoya asar tvachim. Rashi says chagura is hekef shel chavol. You have to make a surround of ropes. Now, if Toysha says chagura means a mechitza, a proper mechitza, but Rashi says it means chavolim. I'm assuming that it means like what we learned about the campgrounds, that it could be either Shesi or Eruv. Toysha seems to say it has to be a proper mechitza, which is both Shesi and Eruv, which is a stronger mechitza, because we learned that for camping, there were kulas in the strength of the mechitza. Okay. Zok the head of the Gemara. Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Huda, Amar Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Allah is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, Pashup Shot. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava limits the use of pasibirois only to a be'er of a rabbin. For Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, loy hutru pasibirois elo lebe'er mayim chayim bilvad. So the question is, why did Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, why did Shmuel have to paskin twice, like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? A, he said the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and then B, he actually spoke out that the halacha is that pasibirois are only good for ber mem chayim, which is essentially saying the same thing as halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So why would Shmuel repeat himself? Zok the Tricha. You need both of these memories of Shmuel. The Yashmin halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. If Shmuel would have just said halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava and not provided the details of the psak, Havamina, I would have thought that he learned different pshat in Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, and I would have thought that he learned the rabbim ba'afilim mechunosim. When Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava just said in our Mishnah that loyetiru pasibirois el be'er harabim, it didn't mean be'er really. The emphasis was on the rabbim. Maybe Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava was limiting the heter of pasibirois to public drinking places, but not necessarily limiting it to be'eris. He says be'eris, the high dekatani be'er harabim, and the reason why Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava used the word be'er is lafukim with Rabbi Kiva. He was just commenting on what Rabbi Kiva said. Rabbi Kiva said be'yochid, he said be'rab. Kamash malon, that no, the lahutru pasibirois, ela lebe'er mayim chayim. So let's see the Mishnah itself to see how that makes sense. So it says over here, Rabbi Kiva said, Echad ba'er rabim ube'er yachid oisin lahem pasim. So the last thing that Rabbi Kiva mentioned was a be'er yachid oisin lahem pasim. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava commented on that last thing that Rabbi Akiva said, and he said, "Ein oisin pasan el be'harabim," but he wasn't trying to limit it to be'er. He was just emphasis on the rabbim, and he was just talking about the last thing, be'er hayochid, that Rabbi Akiva was referring to. So you would have thought that that might be shot in Rav Yehuda ben Bava. Kamashmul and Shmuel, by expressing the halacha lechutru pasuk berois el be'er mayim chayim bavad, that makes it abundantly clear that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava's shita is not only to argue with Rabbi Akiva about the fact that you could only allow it in a rabbim, but also to argue with Rabbi Akiva and say that it's only allowed for a be'er mayim chayim. V'yashvim be'er mayim chayim, and if we would only have had the second thing that Shmuel said, that was lehutru pasuk berois el be'er mayim chayim bavad, where it doesn't mention anything about rabbim or yochid, havamina loishna the rabbim, but loishna the yochid. I would have thought that Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava allows pasuk berois around the be'er mayim chayim, whether it's public or private. Kamashlo halacha Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, that it's only a be'er mayim chayim, and it's only if it's public. Only then are pasuk berois allowed. Anything else, pasuk berois would not be allowed, which is a very big chumrah because he's drastically limiting the scope of the heter that Chacham made for pasuk berois. Zok the Heilige Mishnah. Va'oid Amar Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said another thing. So when we mean va'oid, the Gemara is going to want to know what's the va'oid referring to. The last thing we quoted in the last Mishnah was also Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said something else, and he said the following. Now we know that there's a concept of a karfif shalahukaf ladir. A karfif, we discussed, is an area that's not made to live in, like a field or like a cemetery. It's something that's not made to live in. And by a karfif that's not hukaf ladira, we limit how much space you can encompass with an eruv and make it into a shus hayachid. But since a karfif is a big open space, if it's more than a beis asayim, if it's larger than a beis asayim, the Rabbanan consider it like a karmelis. Even though midaraisa it's Rosh Hashanah, but the Rabbanan, they said it's too big of a place, and we consider it like a karmelis. If we remember, when we discussed the maximum allowable size for pasuk berois, there was a shita of Rabbi Yehuda who limited it to beis asayim, and the reason why he limited it to beis asayim, we learned, is because he was afraid if you allow a karfif bigger, if you allow a pasuk berois greater than the beis asayim, people will be confused, and they'll also allow a karfif bigger than the beis asayim. So they're somewhat related. The Chacham felt no, karfif and beis asayim we have to limit, but pasuk berois have no limit. So this karfif is an area that's not made to live in, so it's not personal living space, and therefore Chazal limited the amount of space of a karfif that you can encompass with an eruv and carry. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said that karfif, hagina v'karfif, a garden, again, which is made to grow vegetables in, which also is not considered ladira, via karfif, and this type of open space, shehim shivim amma v'shirayim, al shivim amma v'shirayim. Now, the square root of 5,000 is 70 v'shirayim, al 70 v'shirayim. So let's think a second. The shear of beis asayim comes from the Chatra Mishkan, which we'll discuss soon, which is 50 amas by 100 amas, which is 5,000 square amas. If you want to provide those same area, 5,000 square amas, in a square, it works out to 70 and a bit by 70 and a bit. And we had already a shaila, if the heter of pasuk berois is only if it's a square, or even if it's a rectangle. There was a shita who held that pasuk berois has to be a square. And we're going to see now that the heter of karfif as well, there are those who hold that it has to be square as well. So what did the Yehuda ben Bava say? Karfif shem shivim amma v'shirayim, al ayin amma v'shirayim, hamukafes geder gavoya sarat, that has a proper eruv around it. Metaltlim b'soichel. So we're saying up to a maximum. So the maximum size that will say the Gather works for is only is only 70 by 70. You're 70 and a bit by 70 and a bit. Uvilvad, but there's another condition according to Ravida above. You also need Sheheba Shumira Oy Bestira. Oy Shetehei Smuchal. You need one of three things. Either there has to be a little hut that that guardsmen have. And Rashi says, Sukkah Sherman, the Alvagav, the hook of Ladira, base of Sayim, who the Sharit Feli. So even though it has a guard tower in it, so it's somewhat hook of Ladira, and there's a big shiloh what Rashi means here, hook of Ladira. Toshis wants to learn that it's not really a real dira like a home, but there's something there. It has a shaykhus to a dira because there is some type of guard tower. You're still limited to a base of sign. Because if Rashi literally means that hook of Adira is limited, so then he's saying not only is a karfif limited, even a place that's hook of Adira is limited. And Tosfos felt that was too big of a chumrah. So Tosfos learns in Rashi that this doesn't mean literally hook of Adira. It's just a weaker type of dira. It's only a guard hut, and that's where you're limited. That's where Avidim and Bava limits the size of this area to 70 by 70. Or Shmucha here, again, the Hoyle Kroiv Levesoi, Daitoi Lishtamish Batomid, Uchehokov Lediradami. Since it's close to the city, it's going to be like your front yard. In your front yard, you store things in. In your backyard, you store things in. Those don't have a limit. So too, here as well, if it's Shmucha it's something that's easier to use for day-to-day storage, and that would be somewhat hukah fadira. But again, it's not mamish hukah fadira, and therefore you're still limited to a maximum size of 70 by 70, v'lo yoser. V'lo yoser. Now Rashi speaks out, which is important to note, u'v'gemora porach tanakama nami hachikamer. The problem is, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is the Tanakama. So what do you mean the Tanakama says the same thing as Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava? He is the Tanakama. So let's just think about this for a second so we'll be prepared when we get up to the Gemara. Excuse me. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava here says that it's a maximum of 70 by 70. Actually, that Rashi is on the next shita. So I'm going to hold my fire till we learn the next shita. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says that a maximum karfif size that you could enclose with fences, and you'll be allowed to carry it like an Rishus HaYachid, is 70 and a bit by 70 and a bit. But he adds additional conditions that you need to have the Shemira or Bestira. You need to have these things. Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, afilu ein ba elabor v'siach l'ma'or metaltel b'socha. It can't be an empty field. There has to be a bore, which is something you might take water out of. Siach ma'or are different types of ditches or caves. You need to have some type of thing there. So it also establishes some type of place where people have a use for in their day-to-day lives, but you don't need something as man-made as a hut. You need a little bit of something in order to allow you to carry in a car.
This is specifically in Rishus HaYachid. And what if it's
Rishus HaYachid is a loaded term. B'daraisa, every karfif is a Rishus HaYachid. The question is, the Darbonon treated it like a carmelis. Since it's a big open area, they treated it like a carmelis. So
what if it was Rishus HaRabim?
By definition, a field is not a Rishus HaRabim. The definition, the Araisa definition of Rishus HaRabim is a place that's a road that's 60 amas wide that multitudes of people walk through. So any field or range or ranch, none of them would be classified midaraisa as Rishus HaRabim. Midaraisa there are Rishus HaYachid.
In the previous Mishnah, we talked about a bore and a private bore in Rishus HaRabim.
Right, that was someone who literally dug a bore on the 401.
How do you do that?
I don't know.
So,
How do you dig a bar on the 401?
no, not okay. Any Rosh Hashanah.
I'm
Why
saying,
did?
but it's equivalent of someone having a private bar smack in the middle of a public thoroughfare.
Yeah. So how does it become a private bar? Somebody digs a hole. It doesn't make it a Rosh Hashanah.
So this concept of Rosh Hashanah and Rosh Hashanah Lagabe carrying on Shabbos has nothing to do with ownership. The classification of what a Rosh Hashanah is and what a Rosh Hashanah is does not.
Oh, right.
Nothing to do with ownership.
Right. It changes the right.
Although yesterday we learned that Yeshua made the roads in Israel that were very difficult to traverse, he did not make them public property. He allowed them to be private property because the one impact that actual ownership has on halachas of carrying is that if it's private property and it's also difficult to walk through, then we won't say that the barriers are knocked down because people walk there. So there's only one small detail where actual ownership impacts these halachas. But generally speaking, ownership has nothing to do with it.
So, okay, one more thing. We use as a source for what size we could use is the Mishkan. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the Mishkan was 50 by 100.
Right.
But the Mishkan had a mechitza all around it, right? So what is the Mishkan considered? A Bershus Rabbim or a Bershus Yachid?
That's a very good question. It was a very public space, but
right.
It was probably considered a Rishus HaYachid because they did avodah on Shabbos and they were moving things for Amos.
Right. But it had an area,
it
had a mechitza all around it.
Right, so maybe that's the point. Since it's like a quasi area with mechitzas, and it was still considered the Rishus HaYachid, from there we learn that the maximum quasi busy area that surrounding with mechitzas would be effective for would be the Mishkan.
So how do you put an Eruv around the city if size is limited?
Because a city is not a karfif. A city is ladira. A city is something that has homes in it that we live in. The problem with the Eruv around the city is when you're encompassing a cemetery. There was even a shot of a park, like Palm Drive Park. There's so many parkettes we have that are bigger than Beis Hasayim. Why don't they ruin the Eruv? Because we're open to them. They're not sealed around. So most poskim hold that a park is kukaf ladira because people eat lunch there sometimes. People pack with themselves a lunch, so it's considered like people live there. But cemeteries are a problem because they're not hukaf ladira, and if the Eruv, the area encompassed by the Eruv, is open to one of these areas and it's not sealed off, then you have a problem. And that's, I think, one of the problems that people raise in the Toronto area.
Okay.
Okay, so let's see what it says over here. But you brought up Mishkan, and I threw out a svara that I don't think is true. I know it's not true, so I have to be intellectually honest, that the biggest area we find that's quasi-public, that surrounded, that people carried in was the Chachar Mishkan. So Frek Tosh is a beautiful kasha. What about the Beis Hamikdash? People carried there too. That was much bigger.
I was thinking the same thing.
I'm sorry?
I was thinking the same thing.
So I was waiting for you to ask that kasha because you were right there.
No, okay. So I kind of answered it myself because the Beis Hamikdash, first of all, it's not the measurements are not written in the Chamisha Torah for the Beis Hamikdash. And the Chamisha Torah is what we use as a criteria for any measurements. It's hard to compare the two. But nevertheless, what is the question then? How can you carry in the Beis Hamikdash?
No, the question is why did Chazal pick this number?
Oh, well, that's
5,000 square ounce.
That's all they could pick. That's all there was.
Because when Shabbos was given, that's all they had.
That's right.
So that's some of what I think what Toshus means. So It was 135 amas square. Vezes Yisrael loy kuf bezayin. It was 187 amas. V'yesh loymers up to the whole milli the Shabbos be mishkan garminulu. Any halach of Shabbos we know from the Mishkan. All the malachas we know from the Mishkan, and it makes sense because that's what they had then. That's one shot. Inami maybe ha'azoris chashivi mukafim ledira shall you shoyim in kol halayla. Not in the Mishkan, but in the Beis Hamikdash, there were guards. There were guards, and since there were guards there all night, that's considered hukaf ledira. So that wouldn't be comparable to what we're discussing, karaf shel hukaf ledira, which is more comparable to the Mishkan. And this opens up a whole hornet's nest of shilas because there's a whole shaila in the Beis Hamikdash if the shomim were there 24 hours or if they only had shomim at night, and is it considered hukaf ladira if they only had shomim at night, or maybe it's only hukaf ladira if they're shomim there 24 hours. So that opens up a whole new avenue. But I'll call upon what we can extract from Tosis is like what you said, is that since all the halachas of Shabbos we learned from the Mishkan, because that's in Chamisha Chumsha Torah, and that's really all they had. That's why all of these halachas are learned from the dimensions of the Mishkan.
I think the Mishkan had Shmira as well, by the way, if we're using that criteria. We see in the pasuk that the Levium were charged with the Shmira of the
I don't know if their Shmir was like we learned in Midas that there were guard stations. There's like 24 guard stations. I don't think it was they have to watch the Kedusha of the Mishkan. I don't think they were like honor guards. In the basement there was actually like honor guards, like standing guard by all the doors. It was inside the Zohar, outside the Zohar. There's a whole bunch of different places they stood. The Odom Rabbi Abova. Hagina v'karfim shem shivim ama v'shirayim al ayin ama v'shirayim hamukaf is keder gavoy asar tvachim v'taltel b'soicha, but he puts in conditions uvat shevay shumira ibestir asher smuchalir. Rabbi Yehuda says not. We also have conditions, but not as strong conditions as Rabbi Abova. Rabbi Yehuda says just less formal structures. Afilu ein ba'elabor v'siyach umayir metaltel b'soicha. Rabbi Akiva takes off all restrictions. It's only size that matters. What's happening inside is not relevant. So everybody seems to agree that the maximum karfif size, shalahuk of ladira, is 70 by 70, about 5,000 square amas, except the first two Tanaim in the Mishnah put conditions even for that type of karfif. So now Rabbi Eliezer first brings up this issue of if it's not square, if it's rectangular, afilu amo achas. So Pashup Pshat and Rabbi Eliezer, which the Gemara will change from, but right now Pashup Pshat is if you're off even by 1 amma. So if you're not 70 and a bit by 70 and a bit, but you're 69 and a bit by 71 and a bit, or whatever the number would be, the whole heter of karfif is only a square, which is interesting because the Chatzar Mishkan was not a square. If Yosy Emer, and the Gemara is going to address that as well. If Yosy Emer, afilu arka pi shnayim berachba, not only does not have to be a square, even if it's a complete rectangle, it's not even close to being a square. Rather, its length is twice as long as the width, such as the Chatzar Mishkan, which was 100 by 50, metalta masoicha. The karfif, the limitation of a karfif is merely its square footage, not its shape.
1 minute. Why don't you say it's the square footage has to be twice the length as the width and no more?
Now you're making it sound like it's better to be square. If anything, it's better to be rectangle. I hear. So the Gemara is going to get into that.
No, but even the rectangle should be limited to twice the width.
So it should be the exact dimensions of the Mishkan.
Well, it should be, it can't be more. It seems to me he's saying it can't be more. Even if it's a rectangle that's twice the width, that's okay, good. But more than that may not be.
I'm not sure. I think he just means to say don't focus on the shape. It's square footage that matters. that matters.
Okay, so I'm not
The
reading.
Gemara is going to drill down into this machlokes. So
Okay.
let's analyze it more then. I'm Rabbi Loy. Shemati Rabbi Lozer. So I heard from Rabbi Lozer the following thing. Let me just look at the Aleph. No, Aleph is something else. Just want to make sure it's not changing the gears here. Eliezer. No, Shemati Rabbi Eliezer. So this is the same one. So this Rabbi Eliezer, who told us a minute ago that you have to stick to a square, I heard another thing from him. Shemati Rabbi Eliezer, afilu hika base kur. I heard even if it's as big as a base kur, so even if it's like a base core, it's still going to be okay. Let me just see something. If Rashi comments on that, he does not. Okay. And then we're quoting some other things. I heard additional things from Rabbi Eliezer. Hey, so now we're departing from the discussion of Karfif, and we're focusing on two other halachas that Rabbi Loi heard from Rabbi Eliezer. Now the halacha is, if there's multiple homes in the chutzner, you have to make Erev Chetzeres. That was the takana we learned a couple of days ago that Shlomo HaMelech made. Well, what if one guy forgot? He didn't make Erev Chetzeres. So now nobody in the entire chutzner, none of the houses in the entire chutzner is allowed to carry. So what is the remedy for that? We're on Shabbos and everybody's locked down. How do you fix that? So the way to fix that is for the person who did not contribute to the Erev, if he renounces, if he's mafkir his ownership in whatever he has in the chutzner. And he says, I'm removing my ownership from the chutzner. So now his personal interest will no longer answer on everybody else. So Rabbi Eliezer commented on that. So Anshe Chutzner, Sheshakach Echad Ben V'lo Irev, Veised. And he didn't make an Erev with them. He did not make an Erev with them. So now he messed them up. And Rashi tells us, Ulamachar Bitel Rishusai L'Chaveroi, Shehi Aiser Salem L'Hoitzim L'Vatein L'Chatzar. Since his ownership in the Chatzar aser them, so he was Mavatal, his ownership. So now they can carry freely. But there's limitations to how they can carry freely. So it says, he is not allowed to bring his items from his home into the chutzner and vice versa, because he doesn't have ownership anymore. If he does bring things from his home into his chutzner, he's showing ownership, and that's now going to cause everybody else in the chutzner to be usher to carry there because he didn't make an error. But they're allowed to bring their kalim in and out, because now that he has no more ownership there, the rest of the people in the chutzner have a proper erev. So Rashi's beisai also lahaknas lahaitzi lachatzel tzarchai. So he's not allowed to bring things from his house in and out, and others can't either help him by bringing his stuff in and out because he has relinquished his rights to the chutzner. But they're actually allowed to bring their things into his house. So anything that belongs to them, they're allowed to move around. His things are not allowed to be moved around because he has pulled himself out of his chutzner. So that's the second halacha that we quoted from Rabbi Eliezer. The third halacha is also not relevant to the Alter Sugya, and that is v'chein shemati mimenu sheyotzin ba'akavel on the Pesach. Akavel is something of a vegetable, and I heard from Rabbi Eliezer that it's good. You can be yotzin the mitzvah of more with it. V'chazarti al kol talmido. Now I heard this quoted in Rabbi Eliezer's name, but I wanted to get verification. So I asked all of his talmidim, did your Rebbe actually allow this halacha? And Rashi says about all of these three halachas, he asked, I couldn't find anybody that was able to corroborate that Rabbi Eliezer actually said these three halachas. Let's hear Rashi. For these three halachas that our Mishnah quotes from Rabbi Eliezer. And I wanted to know him, Shaman Nipiv, if any of his talmidim could testify that they heard these halachas directly from Rabbi Eliezer. But the Gemara Mefarish, the Begin of a Karvav, Loi Shoru Yosy Beis by Gina and Karfif, they were not matter more than the Beis Hasayim. And in the Mishnah, Rabbi Loi quoted even up to Beis Kor. The Gaban Shechotzer, Sovri, the Aflahem Osir Beisoi, Alvimotei and Lechotzer Mutter. But Anshe Chotzer, they're only allowed to bring from their homes into the Chotzer, but they can't bring from their homes into his home. So they're limited, more limited than what we quoted from Belazar. The Gemara Mefarish will tell you. The Gemara is going to explain what the Shaila is. Arkavolan, Sovri Lev Mar, and by this vegetable, whatever it was, that wasn't more. So there's an argument on Rabbi Eliezer and all these three halachas, and Rabbi Loi was not able to get confirmation that Rabbi Eliezer actually said these halachas. Zok the Gemara. Man, my Tana, the Katani Oid. The Mishnah starts off with the Oid Omer Rabbi Yudim Abba. So what did he say earlier that this is an addition to it? Zok the Gemara. Ilaim Mishum the Tani Lei Chada L'Chumra the Katani Achriti. On Amud Beis in the Mishnah at the bottom, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava said a chumrah that you cannot make pasan elul be'er harabim. That was the chumrah, and now Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava has another chumrah about gina and karfif. They're two chumras. They're not related to one another. They're two separate inyanim. But we're just saying not only did he say chumrah A, but he also said chumrah B. Ilam mishum detani lechada lechumrah v'katani achrisi mishum hachi katani v'oid. And you feel that the Tana's word v'oid is appropriate just because it's another chumrah offered up by Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava, by Rabbi Yehuda, the Tani le chada l'chumrah, the katani achriti. Rabbi Yehuda also had a chumrah before, and now in our Mishnah he says another chumrah here. But like katani v'oid. It doesn't say void. So let's see Rashi. Rabbi Yehuda by Loi the tunnel il chad lechomer. What did Rabbi Yehuda say before? He said that the passive berois we limit their size ad beis sosayim in tefillah, and like we learned there, the reason why he limits the size is because he was afraid people would confuse passive berois with karfos. So there was a chumrah there, v'hadar tana achriti, and then there was another chumrah that we learned in a previous Mishnah. That these shall kennel estodin. Rabbi Yehuda said that if there's a rabbin walking through the passive berois, you should divert them so that they shouldn't ruin the mechitzas. So we had two mishnayos earlier in the pair where Rabbi Yehuda says a chumrah, v'loitana v'oid, and by the second chumrah it doesn't say v'oid Omer Rabbi Yehuda this second chumrah of shall kennel estodin. Why not? It's mishum de lav b'chada milsi. Sure, they're both chumras offered up by Rabbi Bar Loi, but they're chumras on two different subjects regarding two different topics. And therefore, it's not appropriate to use the word va'oid if you're talking about a chumrah that's not in the same subject. The Reish Ari b'midas hekef, the first chumrah that Rabbi offered up was the size of the passive berois. The Sefer Ari b'bittul mechitzas, and the Sefer, the second Mishnah was talking about the way a rabbin could break the mechitzas. They're not the same inyan. They might both be talking about passive berois, but they're not the same inyan, and because of that, the Mishnah saw fit not to use the word va'oid. So over here, we're speaking about completely different things. The first chomer of Yehuda ben Bava was passive berois, that it could only be for ber mayim chayim berabim, and now we're talking about karfif, which is two completely separate halachas. Surely the word va'oid is not appropriate. Zok Gemara, there's a difference. Hasan afsaku rabbanon. When Rabbi Yehuda, the reason why we didn't use the va'oid on the second halacha of Rabbi Yehuda is because in between the rabbanon got involved and started and argued with him. Right? Rashi says the kaitan amr loy amr beisasayim el lagina. The rabbanon argued on him. So if we have two halachas from a Tana, one after the other, even though they're about different subjects, but there's no interruption between them, then the Tana would use the word va'oid. By Rabbi Yehuda bar Loi, the reason why he didn't use the va'oid in the second chiddush is because there was an interjection of the rabbanon in between, so we don't use the word va'oid. If you want to say that, I'll prove to you that that's not a reason. The fact that the Rabbanan argued in between is not a reason to refrain from using the word va'oid. Rabbi Eliezer the Sukkah, Dafsakur Rabbanan. In Mitzvah Sukkah, Rabbi Eliezer said that a person has to eat 14 sudas in the Sukkah, and the Chum said, "Ein lever kitzah." And then the Mishnah goes on and says, "Va'oid Omer Rabbi Eliezer, mishalo yachal leli yom tov rishon, yashnun leli yom tov achron." You can make up for missed sudas, and it uses the word va'oid, even though it's talking about exactly the same inyan. It's talking about exactly the same inyan, and even though the Chachamim are arguing in between. So you see the fact that the Chachamim are arguing in between is not a reason not to use the word va'oid. Look at Tony Void. So to Gemara, you have to say, Hasan b'milsei huda afsakua, hacha b'milsa achriti afsakua. If we're sticking to the same subject matter like it was by Rabbi Eliezer, and they're arguing with him on the same subject matter, there you could still use the word void. But by possible rois, where we're talking about two different things, it cannot use the word void. So Rashi fears voice over here. They argued about his inyan, about how many sudas you have to eat. They were discussing the same inyan that Rabbi Eliezer brought up in Sukkah. Our Rabbi Yehuda, when Rabbi Yehuda brought up that the maximum size of Pasi B'Rosh is based on the Rabbanan brought an argument that was a little bit external. The Hadru Rabbanan, the Gina of a Karva for Dir V'Soyar. So therefore, it doesn't use the word V'Oid Bar Beloy. So by Rabbi Eliezer it used V'Oid because the Rabbanan, even though they interjected, it was directly material that was related. So we're still in the sugya, we can use the word V'Oid. But by Rabbi Beloy, the interjection of the Rabbanan was with foreign matter, therefore we don't use V'Oid. In our sugya, there is no hefsek at all. In our sugya, we have Rabbi Yehuda above in the last Mishnah, and it goes right into the Rabbi Yehuda above this Mishnah, even though they're two different inyanim, but since there's no interjection of the Rabbanan in between, we also use the word void. There's no restrictions. The only restriction to a karvev is size. If you're within the proper size, if you didn't exceed the maximum size, then you could carry there. You don't need to have huts, you don't need to have boyers, just the size alone is fine. V'rek to Gemara, Rabbi Kiva, Hainu Tanakama. Rabbi Kiva, who says that you don't need anything, is the same as the Tanakama. Which Tanakama are we referring to? Not in our Mishnah, but in the previous Mishnah. So Rashi, the Tanakama of Amru Loi, Amru Beis Hasayim, El Elgina V'Karfov. Back a couple of Mishnayos ago, when we were discussing the maximum size of a Pasi B'Rois, there the Chachamim told Rabbi Yehuda, the only place, don't restrict the size of Pasi B'Rois. We only find restrictions of size referring to Gina and Karfif. And there, all it mentions is a restriction of size. So that Tana, who was arguing Rabbi Yehuda a couple of Mishnayos ago, held that it's only size that restricts it, which is exactly what Rabbi Kiva says here. So Rabbi Kiva Hani Tanakama. Rabbi Kiva seems to be saying exactly the same thing. Is a Tana that we had a couple of Mishnayos ago that was talking about Pasi B'Rois. So to Gemara, there's a difference. Ike beinayu dover mu'ut. There's a small amount of land that would be the difference between Rabbi Kiva and the Tana of the earlier Mishnah.
Sorry, Yosy, I know Akiva's not here, but the name of the shir could be Size Matters.
Okay, I like that. The Tanya. The Tanya. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Dover Mu'ut Yesh Al Shivim Ama V'Shirayim V'Lo Nosnu Chacham B'Shir. Now, where does the 70 and a third come from? We have sophisticated mathematical formulas, and we could take our calculator. We know the area of 50 by 100 is 5,000, and we can go to our calculator and push square root, and it'll tell us exactly what the size is. But it seemed like in the days of the Gemara, they figured out square roots in a much longer a more complicated process. So let me just do the square root just to get it quickly. So we have the exact amount. Square root of 5,000 equals 70.71. It's a very long fraction, but it's 70.710. So it's just over 70. That's the exact area of the exact area of 5,000 square amos would be 70.71 by 70.71 amos. They figured it out a little differently. And the way they figured it out, there's going to be a little bit less space because the dover muat that they're adding is approximately 2/3 of an amma. So it's 70 and 2/3. I'm sorry, 70 and 1/3. It's about 70 and 1/3 of an amma by 70 and 1/3 of an amma, and that square is actually a little bit less than 5,000 square ammas. It's about 49 and change. So here's how it does it. The chamashir sasayim kechatzar mishkan. So it's a little bit. So what it is as follows. Again, tell you, there's a little bit more space in 5,000 square amas than there is in 70 squared. The Chum didn't specify exactly what it is. The Kamashir Sasayim is Kechatzer Mishkan. Now Rashi goes through a long way of figuring it out. I don't want to go through the whole cheshbon, but I'll just go through it briefly. Okay, if you have 50 by 100. So let's take the area 50 by 100 that you can see in the picture. So let's start off with a square of 50 by 50. And then the other 50, let's break it up into smaller components. So what Rashi suggests is to break it up into 5 areas that are 10 amas wide by 50 amas long. Okay, then what he does is you take the square that's 50 by 50 and you add a strip of 10 amas by 50 amas to each end. So now from end to end, you're actually 70 by 70, right? Now you're still missing the corners. I need 4 patches that are each 10 by 10. So from this 5th strip, I can take 4 of those patches, fill in the corners, and now I have a square of 70 by 70, but I still have 1 patch of land that's 10 amas by 10 amas. So then Rashi takes us through another round of slicing this up into thin strips and add a strip all the way around, which would be 1/3 of an amma. And what's going to happen is when you try doing that, you're going to be a drop short. So what's going to happen is it comes out that this square of about 70 1/3 by 70 1/3 is actually a little bit less than the full 5,000 square ammas. We can do it with a calculator so much faster than creating all these strips and wrapping it around the perimeter. But at the end of the day, that's how it works out, that the 70 1/3 by 70 1/3 is actually a drop smaller than the full 5,000 square ammas, which would be 50 by 100. So the Gemara wants to suggest that is the machlokes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yehuda. So Rashi says as follows: the full 5,000 square ammas is a drop bigger than the 49 and change if you try to square it out using the formula of constantly cutting small strips. The Tanakama earlier, Shari Bevesa Saim Shleiman. It's mutter to have a karfif of a full 5,000 square ammas. You can't go over a full 5,000 square ammas. Rabbi Akiva, Shivim B'Shirayim al Shivim B'Shirayim B'Sulai. According to Rabbi Akiva, the maximum karfif size would be about 49, 44 square ammas. So it would be a little bit less. Like the Gemara said earlier, that Tzasayim is Kechatzer Mishkan. So that's the primary difference. Approximately 50 square ammas is going to be the difference between Rabbi Akiva in our Mishnah and the Tanakama in their earlier Mishnah. How do you know that you're supposed to go square? And this really is the kasha that David Zolti asked. If we're learning it out of the Chatzar Mishkan, it was rectangular. So where do you, if anything, you should put emphasis on a rectangle. the Mishnah is making it sound almost like a rectangle is a concession. Really, a rectangle is the ideal shape because that's what we're seeing at the Mishkan. Amar Buddha, the Amar Kra, the Torah talks about the dimensions of the Chatzar. The Torah says something a little bit unusual. And it says as follows: Orech HaChatzar Mea Ba'ama, V'roichav Chamishim B'Chamishim. What does that mean, Chamishim B'Chamishim? It should V'roichav Chamishim. What's the double notion of Chamishim B'Chamishim? So Amar Torah, Toil Chamishim Vasavev Chamishim. Take the 50 square amas, take the extra 50 square amas that you have, because you have 50 by 100, and use it to wrap around the existing 50 to get to a square. So the pasuk by saying chamishim b'chamishim is hinting to us that we have to do it that way. Amar Torah chamishim v'savev chamishim. So that it's a drash. Of course, it's a drash, and that drasha is telling us that when we're assessing the area of the chutzner, we should square it off, and that's why there are shittas in our Mishnah. All that has to be squared. Pasha the Krabba might say, but what's Pasha that tied to the pasuk when it says chamishim b'chamishim? Amar Abaye, what it means is Hamid Mishkan al Sfas Chamishim. Set up the Mishkan. How should you position the Mishkan in the actual Azara? Set it up that it should be right at the edge of 50, meaning the opening, the entrance to the actual Mishkan structure should be on the 50-yard line. Hamid Mishkan al Sfas Chamishim Kidei Shehei Chamishim Amal Lefanov, so that when you're coming in through the eastern gate of the Azara, go 50 amas of clear space till you encounter the Mishkan, and then on either of the three sides around the Mishkan, the Esher Amal Lechol Ruach V'Ruach. So let's see how that looks, because again, the picture will make it much easier to understand. So here's a picture of the chutzner. The chutzner we know is 100 by 50. So chamishim b'chamishim is when you place the mishkan, have it that its opening should be exactly at the 50-yard line. So you come in to the Azara from the front, and you have to walk a full 50 amas, is a full 50 by 50 of open space until you get to the mishkan. Now the mishkan we know was 10 amas wide by 30 amas long, inside dimension. The thickness of the actual crushing was an amma. So it was really 12 wide by 31 long, because the back wall is an amma, there's no front wall. So really, there's only 19 on either side. But Rashi tells us it's not exact, it's 20 including the thickness of the wall. It's 20 amas until the inner side of each wall. And that's what the pasuk means, pasuk pshat. In chamishim b'chamishim, it's talking about how you should position the mishkan within the Azara, that the entrance should be right at the 50-yard line. Zok the Gemara v'Lazar im hoisa arka, if it was not square. Frank the Gemara. Thank you very much. V'Tanya B'Lazar Aimer im hoisa arka yeser al pi shnayim barachba. Not if it's off by 1 amma, but if it's more than 50% off, meaning if it's 100, if it's 100 by 50, it's okay. But if it's 101 by 48, that's when you have a problem. Then I feel amma achas emetalcham b'soicha. Amar bibi barbaye ki nan nami masnisin yeser al pishnayim berachba. So when Rabbi Elazar said in our Mishnah, let's look back to see the Mishnah inside, when Rabbi Elazar said in the Mishnah, it doesn't mean if it's off square. If it's off square, you're still fine. As long as you're not more skewed than 50 by 100, as long as it's not narrower than 50 and longer than 100, you won't have a problem. So that's the limit. So it's not really focusing on the square. It just means the size of the rectangle shouldn't be more than twice, the length shouldn't be more than twice the width. Zok to Gemara weiter. Ihaki Hanu Rabbi Yosy. Isn't that what Rabbi Yosy said? Because Rabbi Yosy in our Mishnah says the same thing, that it has to be square. Let's have a look at the Mishnah again. Rabbi Yosy Aimer, afilu arka pishnayim berachba v'talta b'soicha. See, Rabbi Yosy himself says that up to double up to the length, be double the width is going to be good. So now that we're explaining Rabbi Eliezer to be saying the same thing, what will be the difference between Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Eliezer? So to Gemara, the difference will be Rivua, the Rivua Rabbanon, the square that the Rabbanon made it. And what that means is what we just discussed, that little extra. So let's see Rashi. If the length is double the width, that's too big. Umiu ikra orcha pishnayim berachba. Nevertheless, the best dimension is to be rectangular. Like it says in the Pasuk. But less le rivua, he holds there's no advantage of having a square. Umiu imarba lo mitra. So Zok to Gemara, and this is exactly what David Zolti brought up earlier. What is the ideal shape? Is the ideal shape, if I ask the Rabbanan and I want to enclose my karfuf, what's the best way to do it? Will they tell me do it in a rectangle, or will they tell me to do it in a square? According to Rabbi Yosy, they'll tell me to do it in a square. But if it's off, it'll be okay. But according to Rabbi Elazar, according to Rabbi Elazar, you're better off doing it as a rectangle. That's right. According to Rabbi Yosy, it's better as square. According to Rabbi Elazar, if you ask them how to do it, they'll tell you make it a rectangle. That's how we want it. Now we don't want the rectangle to be too long. It should be 50 by 100. It shouldn't be 102 by 48. But we'd rather have a rectangle. But if you'd ask Rabbi Yosy, he would tell you if you ask Rabbi Yosy how to make a karfuf, he'll tell you make it a square. Yeah, if you have to make it a rectangle, it'll be good as well. But the best way to make it is with a square. So ultimately, the machlokes Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva is exactly what David Zolti brought up all the way at the beginning of the shir. Are you better off doing it in a square, or are you better off doing it in a rectangle? Rabbi Eliezer holds you're better off doing it in a rectangle because that was the actual dimensions of the Mishkan. And Rabbi Yosy holds because of the drasha of chamishim b'chamishim, ideally you want to make it in a square shape, but they both agree that anywhere from square up to a rectangle where the length is double the width would be good. If the length is more than double the width, that's when we'll have a problem. Rabbi Yosy, Itmar, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Yosy. Halacha is like Rabbi Yosy. Rabbi Bibi, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Halacha Rabbi Akiva. So now Rabbi Yosy and Rabbi Akiva are saying two different things. So let's have a look. Halacha Rabbi Yosy. The loy boy murabas. Rabbi Yosy says it doesn't have to be square. Halacha Rabbi Akiva, loy boy mukavas ladira. Rabbi Akiva holds you don't need to have any structures in it. Rabbi Akiva says no matter, even if it's empty, up to that size is going to be good. As Dubi said, Rabbi Akiva holds size matters, and that's all that matters. So we have a psak like Rabbi Yosy, and we have a psak like Rabbi Yehuda. V'tavaya l'kula, and they're both psak piskei halacha that are kulas, right? Rabbi Akiva is a kula. You don't have to have any structures in there. All you need is the maximum size. And Rabbi Yosy holds that even a square is good. Utricha. The Yashmin halacha Rabbi Yosy, if Shmuel would have only told us the kula that the halacha of Rabbi Yosy havamina adika shemira ibeistira, I would have thought you need to have some structure inside it. Kamash v'lo halacha Rabbi Akiva, that no, once you have this size, you don't need to have anything inside it. The Yashmin halacha Rabbi Akiva, and if he would have only told us the halacha Rabbi Akiva, havamina the arich v'katan loy, I would have thought that if it's rectangle, it's not good. Kamash v'lo halacha Rabbi Yosy, that even a square is going to be good. Zok Gemara. What happens by a karfif shehu yoshim beis hasayim? You had a karfif that was bigger than the beis hasayim, but it was shahukaf ladira. You surrounded it to build a residential complex. You had houses in it. You surrounded it in such a way where it's ladira, and there's no restriction. But what happened is afterwards nizarubay. You got half or more than half of this karfif. You took away any residential structures and you planted vegetables there. So Areyu Kagina, it becomes like a Gina, the Osir. And now it's going to ask, since Roiv of this area is now not Hukaf Ladira, it asks the whole area, it cannot carry there. How about Notarubai? How about you didn't plant vegetables there? You planted trees there. Trees are something that's normal. It's like landscaping. No one uses vegetables. No one plants a tomato garden as landscaping. But a nice tree, it's normal for people to plant this landscaping, so that doesn't take away from the hukul fladira. It retains the status of a regular yard, umutter, and it's still considered hukul fladira. Nizra ruboy. What if you planted roiv, like we discussed earlier? Amar B'Shua loy amram elo yoshim beis sasai. The only time we say that if you planted roiv, it's going to answer the whole yard. That's only if it was a huge yard, and the part that was planted was yoshim beis sasai. So if you just have one area that's yoshim beis sasai and you plant roiv, that wouldn't be a problem. The problem is if the area planted was yoshim beis sasai. Abel beis sasai, if you only planted 5,000 square amas and not a drop more, mutter, that would be mutter anyway. Why would that be mutter? So Tamar command Reb Shimon, it's according to Reb Shimon who holds that you're allowed to carry from chotzer to chotzer, from one rishus yachid to another. The Tanya Reb Shimon Omer, echad gagois, ve'echad chatzerois, ve'echad karfifois, rishus echad achas hein lekelim sheshafsu b'soichan, v'loy lekelim sheshafsu b'soichabayis. There's a machlokes between Reb Shimon and the Chacham. The Chacham hold that you're not allowed to carry kalim from one roof to another roof, from one yard to another yard, from one carpet to another carpet. Shimon holds kalim that were left in your chotzer, you're allowed to move over to your neighbor's chotzer on Shabbos. Or if it was kalim was left on your roof, which is also used as storage, you can move it to your neighbor's roof on Shabbos. That's only kalim that were left outside. Kalim that were inside your house, you're not allowed to take out to your chotzer. We're talking about, of course, where there is no Eruvin. But from chotzer to chotzer is allowed. So Reb Shimon is the one who holds that you're allowed to take out from one rishus yachid to another rishus yachid. Therefore, he holds that if you had a carpet that was not beis hasayim, it wasn't planted, it was planted less than the beis hasayim. Therefore, he held if you had stuff outside, you'd be allowed to move it back and forth from your area to the planted area. It would be allowed because it's no difference than going from one chotzer to another chotzer where there's no area. We'll stop here because this gets into a whole new sugya, and we're going to have to start over anyway from our Puna tomorrow because it gets into a whole new sugya. So let's stop here. So Adobe, I need help. Is Adobe still there? I need help in this